Hi and welcome to this week's mailbox, and a few questions here. The first one, there were a few questions this week which I sort of could do an entire video on, as sometimes is the case, one of which I am going to be doing. But for this one, it's about raiding. It says, you mentioned your guild puts raid markers on the singularity points for Kill Jaden. Are those actually helpful for anyone? My guild does it too, blah, blah, blah. Feel off would be better without them. Like it's faster to just look at where the singularity physically is and go there. This comes down to a little bit of debate about what should be called during a raid and what shouldn't. Obviously, during a raid, you don't want constant chatter. You don't want... I'm very much against people constantly calling out timings. Oh, this ability is next, this ability is next, this ability is next. Because then it makes it more difficult for someone to call something out, something that's new, some information like, oh, I'm dead, I won't be able to soak the next blah, or something like that. But it's also come to one of these things we talk about Mythic in particular. So if it's something like the singularities on Kill Jaden, which can spawn randomly, and it's like looking around where it is, do you get 20 people all to have to look at that one place? Or do you get one person to do it and they call it out? Because it's, again, about errors. If you have one person who's going to call it out, then that means you avoid a situation where you have to have 20 people all identify quickly enough where it is without errors. And because as soon as there's an error, that's going to kill you immediately. And it all comes down to that. You will sometimes, I mean, because you've got to bear in mind at those points, some people will have other things they need to be doing. So they're concentrating on a job. You have other people who are not particularly doing anything. Like at that particular point, they may not be soaking in Armageddon, for example. So they're just milling around in the middle anyway, or doing some DPS or whatever, free to zoom their camera around because they're not looking for where the Armageddon is that they need to soak and to check that others are soaked as well. So it's much better from that point of view. So I would say always with something like that, you get one person to call it out rather than have everyone all have to independently look, because that's teamwork. Now, where I would call things out that are on timers, because everyone, of course, should have their timers. And if there's one that's particularly important to you, if you use bigwigs, for example, you can have it give a countdown. You obviously don't want countdowns to everything, because then you start to tune out the countdown, because it's no longer important. Have it for one ability per boss, I would say. Or at least, if there's a really important ability in one phase that's not going to be in a later phase, you could use it then on a later phase. But don't have it on two abilities that could happen one after the other, or anything like that. But sometimes you get a particular ability that when you're initially progressing a fight, it's the sort of thing you eventually expect people to be in tune with or to pay attention to. But maybe early on it's the cause of your deaths. Again, it's one of these situations, which is better to expect everyone to note this timing, which they should be able to do if it's on a timer. But every time someone dies to it, or a few people die to it, and then what are you left to do? You're left to moan at people for not paying attention. Or do you just call it out and no one dies? Which is better. It's inevitably better just to call it out. And what you usually find is with some of these things, eventually you don't have to call it out. You know, it's a bit like, say, Hydra Shot on Mistress Azine. Initially, you're sort of saying, you know, soak your marker, look at your marker, get in there. Or on Maiden, on Mythic Maiden, where you have to call out, check which lane you're going to be soaking. Eventually, you don't have to do that because people have got it into there. So it's not the sort of thing that has to be called out every time after that. But when it is something that's a random spawn in a fight, it's always way better if someone sees where it is just to call it out. Because then you don't have 20 people spinning their cameras around looking when they could be focusing on something else. Whether that focusing on something else is doing another mechanic. Because that's what you find on the trickiest bosses. The most difficult bosses are not the bosses with the most difficult mechanics. I don't think any single mechanic in the game is difficult. Where you get difficult bosses, usually it's when there's a combination of difficult mechanics. So the three, it always seems to be three as well, doesn't it? So the three in Timur Sargeras, for example, one we just finished. I can't really comment on Antorus at the moment. Mythic hasn't even opened. But you've got Mistress Azine, Fallen Avatar, Mythic Kill Jaden. All of those three bosses had abilities that would run together, where you'd have to be dealing with two things at once, eventually. And that's what makes them difficult. So to have someone be able to point one thing out, and then that leaves everyone else to go, oh yeah, it's over there, great. And then they can focus on the other things as well. it massively reduces the chances of error. Okay, next one. This was about my what I thought was my top 5 most important cinematics. Obviously, not everyone's going to agree with this one. There's a couple of others, but there were quite a few people felt the bombing of Theramore was one. Now, with some of the other cinematics, I could sort of see why people would want to put it in, even though, you know, my 5 were my 5. But the Theramore one, I'm genuinely perplexed. And someone even said they thought I was being sarcastic because, you know, someone said here, I'd say the bombing of Theramore is super important for faction hatred since blah, 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 making it more of a horde event than a garage event. This wasn't the only comment that sort of thought that should be in there. And I said, was it? What's the long-term effect other than the current tour needing a new leader and Jaina getting a bit stroppy? And then someone replied, I don't know if that's sarcasm. It's not sarcasm. It says you're underselling the importance of that event. But the problem is, no one's explaining to me what the importance of the event is. What's the long-term effect? As in where we are now, we're now several years after the bombing of Theramore. It was a major enough event at the time, but what's the long-term effect of it? I genuinely don't know what the long-term effect of it is. Garrosh, who ordered it, is long since out of the way. And this event isn't what caused him to be shoved out of the way. You know, it was just the start of him going from, you know, being a bit of a stubborn war chief to being an outright villain. That's just really what started it off. But the event itself, you know, it changed Jaina's view about the Horde. Someone said something about it meant that the Horde lost an alliance ally. But what has the effect been? Nothing as far as I can tell, because Jaina went from supporting peace between the Alliance and the Horde to wanting the Horde destroyed. I mean, not immediately there, but, you know, began the chain of events. So Jaina, I mean, we don't know what she's going to be like now in the next expansion, but in the here and now, she's someone who wants the Horde destroyed, dismantled, as she put it, first of all. Has that happened? No, because in actual fact, the Alliance leaders have now railed against her. The status quo was maintained. There is this mistrust of each other between Horde and Alliance, but there hasn't been, until the next expansion, of course, all-out war. Battle for Azeroth is going to change that, but there's no suggestion at all that Jaina, even though she's coming back, is going to be directly involved in that decision. From what we can tell, it's going to be Sylvanas that pulls the strings there. So, you know, and the reason I'm saying this now here as well is because I want people to hear, because I did reply to this person, but if they reply back, unfortunately, the way YouTube is, I won't see it. Because when someone replies to a comment I've put on there, it's a shame that I can't, I mean, maybe there is a way, but I've not seen a way to get myself notified of that, which means, you know, and obviously I get so many comments that I'd be looking at a comment over a week ago by the time the person replies. So, and they may not get the notification that I've replied to them either. That's just the way it works. So I'll put it here again. So if anyone is able to explain to me what the long-term consequences of Theramore are, then I will sort of tackle that in a future video as well. Next one, it says, why aren't Night Elves paladins? A paladin is a warrior priest. Night Elves can be both warriors and priests. This is true. Unfortunately, when you follow that to its natural conclusion, so can gnomes, and that's a thing that must never be. Thankfully, it is a thing that is never going to be, so forget about any comments about, yay, gnome paladins. No, Ian Hazakostas himself, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, has said gnome paladins would not make sense. It's not happening. That's all there is to it. Now, it is true that they're sort of a mix. Like the first paladins, some of them came from a more martial background. Some of them came from a more clerical background. And then they both sort of learned both roles. But the other thing to bear in mind is the paladins are an order. This is the only way that it makes sense, Blizzard saying that Anduin is a priest and not a paladin. Because, you know, when they said that, that like blew me away. Because as has been noted, and this is the sort of, hopefully the last thing I have to say on it. As has been noted, Anduin uses paladin abilities in the cinematic. Because what you notice when the troll attacks him, what does he do? He uses 3 Crusader Strikes. What does 3 Crusader Strikes allow you to do? Oh, that's 3 Holy Power. You can use a Spender now. What does he do after those 3 Crusader Strikes? He uses a big old Spender. Finishes it off. Don't tell me that's not a Paladin ability. But I accept he's not a Paladin because Blizzard have said so. And what a Paladin is not just someone who has those abilities. but someone who has specifically been inducted into the Order of the Silver Hand. So he's the sort of person who easily could be inducted into that if he wanted to, but maybe he doesn't want to. That's fine. So I accept that he's not. But yeah, and then the same applies here. Night Elves can be warriors and Night Elves can be priests. So lore-wise, there isn't anything really stopping Night Elves becoming paladins as long as they decide to agree to give up their tree hugging. But they just are... Well, there's one at the moment, an NPC, which of course could be argued as paving the way for Night Elf Paladins at some point. But it's obviously not on the horizon at the moment. But it is one of those where in theory they could... It would certainly make a lot more sense than the Night Elf Mage, which really shouldn't have been. But in terms of why they aren't, I just strongly suspect it's because there doesn't need to be. You know, Horde don't have very... I mean, the Tauren Paladins came in because at that time Horde had no choice at all of the Paladins. It could only be a Blood Elf. And they had to sort of create a new explanation for it to even allow that. Although I'd have rather had Undead Paladins. That would have made more sense. But Alliance have choice. You know, they've got humans, dwarves, Draenei. They don't really need another one. If there were to be another one, Night Elves would be fine. That would be okay. There'd be no real problem with that. Especially, as I say, as there is in the lore now. And there is a Night Elf Paladin as an NPC. Next one. Right, this one might take a bit of discussion. So I think a good support class... This was talking about the idea of support classes, which I don't think we're ever going to get in WoW. I think it's too long in the tooth to shift this. But it says, I think a good support class, 3 specs. One that focuses on DPS and buffing DPS. One that focuses on healing and buffing healing. And one that is tanky but also does mitigation for those within a certain radius. Those would sound quite good in theory. I think the problem is those sort of things would be good maybe for a new MMO. With World of Warcraft, there are certain things... There are things that change over time. And, you know, I am planning a longish video on that at some, you know, within the next week or so. But there are some things that sort of have to be a bit set. So I don't... That would massively change the nature of the game in terms of group work. And I don't think they would go for that. But it says this class would not really be suited to any of the traditional roles extraordinarily well on their own, but they would be extremely viable in a group situation. Now, for me, what you'd have to do in a situation like that is have it so that you could, let's say you do the DPS one, focus on DPS and buffing DPS. You'd have to have it so that they could also have the option of being a pure DPS. The way I would perceive it is not free movement within a fight, because that would make it overpowered, but have a situation where you could use your abilities and it's just full on DPS and it doesn't really add any utility. Or with a little change of spec, or even talents, because I have an idea for talents on this one, that they switch to that mode. So the way it could work is this. Let's say you have a whole talent line that... A bit like Gladiator spec, that which is gone now, but they came in as a little gimmick during Warlords of Draenor for warriors. But the way it would work is you would have a whole talent line that didn't just give you a new ability or change an ability, but changed what loads of abilities do. It's like a separate talent line. So let's say, just as an example, let's say it was for Paladins, Retribution Paladins. So one of them was just full-on DPS. So what it is, it's like we are now. You would just be a DPS class. That's all there is to it. Then let's say you select the other talent. The other talent now means that using those same abilities does less damage, but it does healing, like healing around you. You know, AoE healing. So it'd be useful for healing melee and tanks that would be in that area. So within a certain range, it does, like, you know, whether it's smart healing or just general AoE healing. There'd be different choices, different abilities with different types of heal. So instead of you using your abilities based on how you're going to do maximum damage to whether it's single target AoE, you're now using your abilities, instead of trying to maximize damage, to maximize the effective healing. So maybe when you want to do a lot of healing to the group around you, so there's loads of raid damage coming in, for example, even if you're on a single target boss, you're using your AoE abilities because what you want to do is AoE healing. And let's say you want to just heal the tank and other people don't need it, then even if it's an AoE situation, use your single target abilities because what you want to do is heal the tank. That sort of thing, just as throwing something out there. And then the third one could be the one that, again, adds mitigation. So, again, you do less damage, but you take less damage, and you also give other people a sort of damage reduction around them. Now, instantly you look at that and you think that would be extremely powerful, and that is the problem. That's why I don't see anything like that ever coming into the game, because at the moment it would be difficult to see why you wouldn't definitely want to take the classes that had access to these, because it would be very powerful. Whereas if it had been built from the ground up in a new MMO, that's the sort of thing I can see being there. And the person talks here about, like in a dungeon, for example. So we have 5-man dungeons in World of Warcraft. 1 healer, 1 tank, 2 DPS, and 1 support as the actual choice of people you take in there, and that it's actually balanced around that. And again, I think that would be a pretty good idea as well. So I would like that, but I just don't see it coming into WoW. But it would be a good idea for, or I think it'd be a good idea. It certainly has potential. I'm not saying I've thought through all the nuts and bolts of it, but for like a World of Warcraft 2, if ever that became a thing, maybe it wouldn't, or whatever MMO they decide to do, might do it on a different franchise, then that's the sort of thing I would definitely like to see. Would we see it? I don't really know, because, you know, I'm not going to say my knowledge of MMOs is varied, but I don't really see much evidence of this in MMOs. Sometimes they try a little bit. Like Discipline Priest is what I would call, I think it's fairly successful in many ways, but it's what I would call a half-assed attempt at it. By necessity, Blizzard had to do it, not because they thought it was a great thing to do, this half a DPS and half a healer, but by necessity, because Priests had developed this 2 healing specs, and they needed to make Discipline Priests a meaningful healing spec, and so that's the way they went with it. But I don't think they went that way because they thought it was a fantastic idea to have this half and half. So the question remains, what would the class be to fill this role? Duh. Well, Paladin Priest would be top of the list there. You know, but you could have other ones as well. You could have a tank where one of the... tank, sorry. Tank. But Warrior, I was going to say, with one of the specs being the one that you suggest there that does the buffing, the damage reduction and stuff like that, as well as healing. So maybe there's a particular spec of Warrior, say Arms Warrior, just for the sake of argument, where one of those 3 talents, one of them is just, you know, does its thing, DPS. One of them does the reduced damage, but buffs the DPS of other people around them. And the third one, reduced damage, but buffs the damage reduction of people around them, that sort of thing. And again, it's not something you can switch modes during a fight, because it's a talent. You have to, for that fight, choose which one you're going to be. But it would add, you know, a lot of flexibility to it. And it's the sort of thing you can actually do for every class. You can actually do this for every class. The downside is that you'd have to, you know, it's one of these things where, because Blizzard are really keen on lots of different classes all having their class identity, their class fantasy, I hate that term. Nonetheless, you'd create a situation where it would be very difficult to make it very different for all 12 classes there. And you'd have to add in a new spec for Demon Hunters, wouldn't you? Or would you? Or would you just add in those 3 talents? I suppose you could. Yeah, maybe the Demon Hunters, a bit like the Warriors. But then again, yeah, it's one of those things where it becomes a bit, which do you do? And it moves it more towards the old bring the player, not the class, which is not really something they want to do now. But anyway, right, next one. On to the old trinkets one I did for Strength one. It says, did you forget Spectral Betrayal? No, I didn't. And I suspect sarcasm here. Not an important from Tomb of Sargeras at all. Oh, lol, oh my. Well, 1, it's not. 2, it was powerful under a particular situation. There were I wasn't doing every trinket in the game. I was specifically doing Antorus trinkets, but with a few of the other trinkets that you may have been using that you may want to compare them to. Spectre of Betrayal was specifically not chosen because it can be misleading on Sims. And I have so many comments of people who do not read their Sims properly. You know, there's too many people. I mean, I know we say to sim it and you have to sim it, but there's too many people just go and look at the number and just accept it. Sometimes you have to bear in mind that simulations are based upon the work, often unsung, of members of the community. It's got nothing to do with Blizzard. Blizzard don't help with it at all. These are members of the community giving up their time to help it out. But without wishing to be a bit mean about it, some people do it better than others. And there are things that can be wrong in Simcraft or don't work properly. And even when it does work properly, there are still things that can be misleading. So Spectre of Betrayal, for those who don't know, is a trinket, which is a non-use trinket, and it makes like an aberration spawn, like an elemental type thing. And it pulses some damage for a few seconds. And after a minute, it will disappear. But you can use the trinket 45 seconds later. So if you use it before the first one disappears, a second one pops up, but they both pulse their damage. Now, that's brilliant, unless someone moves the boss or whatever mob it is you've used it on. So what you can easily have is a situation where you used it on the boss player, 3 seconds, by the time 45 or even 50 or 55 seconds, however you want to leave it, the boss has been moved somewhere else. You do it again, all right, sure, your first one starts, you know, they both start pulsing damage, but the first one you had out there is pulsing its damage nowhere. There's no damage being done because it's miles away. But the sim will assume that the boss doesn't move anywhere. So it can be a bit misleading. Now you can account for that, but you can't just press a button on Simcraft and say account for that. You have to do it yourself. So I don't want to put it in there because it always, Spectre of Betrayal always looks better on most fights than it really is. It's a bit like Anguish, the Anguish trinket from Demonic Inquisition, which is a trinket I coined with a socket in like the second week of Timor Sargeras, and I never bothered to put a gem in it because I knew I would never use it on any fight ever. And that's all there is to it, because the sims just make them look better than the realistic situations will allow it to be. At least Spectre of Betrayal can be good on some fights, but a really small number of fights. So that's the reason for that. So I do have reasons for choosing the trinkets I chose, because it's no extra work really just to add in a few trinkets anyway. It's only extra work if you want to do combinations of trinkets, which I only did for the Antorus ones. It's just I try to avoid misleading situations. Next one, Afrasiabi said in one of the interviews, Q&As, that it would be cool to see, this is about Azerite armour by the way, cool to see people getting different traits on similar items for different situations. The Azerite thing doesn't sound like it's character based, no good. I certainly hope it's not, and it would make a lot of sense for this. Item based, Ian stated in the recent dev Q&A they wanted to incentivise raids, he did indeed. So the helms, shoulders and chest pieces might have traits you can't find elsewhere. And this would certainly be really good if the traits that were on your Azerite armour were attached to those pieces of armour, as opposed to they were just set for your character. That would be quite good, as long as there's no, I mean, they did sort of indicate no RNG nature of it, but that also that it was something that would stay relevant throughout the expansion. So it would definitely make sense if these Azerite armour pieces dropped in all of the types of content. So you've got Azerite armour pieces for doing presumably PvP, for doing dungeons, for doing raids, you know, even some world bosses, I think, maybe. I don't know. Should it just come from world group content? Possibly. I'm not sure. But either way, the idea that, you know, because tier's sort of gone, but this is replacing it, you could argue. So maybe what we look for is, okay, that Azerite chest piece has traits that would be really good for me, so I want that when the next raid comes out and so on. I suppose the downside to this, which is the same downside that tier has, is that if you have a really good trait on it, and then the next tier comes out, and the other one starts to fall behind because of item level, you're sort of forced to upgrade with it, even though that trait isn't as good. Does that mean also, is it going to be the same as tier in that they want you to use the latest Azerite armor pieces, and they start nerfing the traits on the previous ones, like they've nerfed set bonuses on tier? It would also open that sort of whole can of worms as well. So getting people to go back and try and get them Titan Forge on the really good ones. There's pros and cons to this, but it would certainly meet the condition that Ian did say, in that he wanted to incentivize people to do the more difficult content. That he said raiders would be getting better gear than Mythic Plus, you know, from Mythic Plus dungeons, and Mythic raiders better than Heroic raiders and normal raiders and so on. So it would allow for that to be the case, certainly. But, you know, we may only be a couple of months away from finding out. Perhaps, depends when the beta does launch, what it launches with. How much of it, is it just going to be very bare bones? Or is it going to be, I'm not going to say close to a finished expansion, of course, that's not possible. But at least having a lot of the content in so you can just get straight in. Much more like a beta as opposed to the alphas of the past couple of expansions. Next one, really long one. And I've cut this a little bit because it gets to the main point. So this is what I was talking about in terms of, which I still haven't done the video for, this is still in production. Heroic guilds that want to move on to Mythic and what sort of things hold them back and what they need to plan more in advance. And what I say is, really what you need to do is think roster, because what is one big barrier, there's multiple barriers for heroic guilds wanting to then go into Mythic. You know, I think it's very difficult for a guild to switch modes and to get their raiders to switch modes between doing it on heroic and doing it on Mythic. It's very different. But I said that one of the big barriers always seems to be they say that they haven't got enough people. At that point, at the point at which you want to do Mythic and you haven't got enough, you're basically screwed. Because you're going to try and recruit people going, right, we're ready to go into Mythic now, we need Mythic Raiders. So let's say you've got 17 people on average that can turn up, and that's quite high compared to a lot of guilds in this situation. But let's say you had 17. On any given night, you need at least 20, and even that must have the right balance. So you try and recruit someone, you're recruiting this person. Okay, so you're going into Mythic now, are you? Well, we will be when we get another 2 people after you. Well, that means you're not going into Mythic, so you're not likely to be able to recruit them. They'll just join a guild that's already doing Mythic, that's already got that roster. So you need to have that roster size at least beforehand. Even if there's a few people that you think might not be up for it or up to the job, you need the physical numbers to be able to get in there and actually kill some bosses. But the person saying here is, I have to disagree with one point in particular. I think there's a misunderstanding on this one. It says, the idea that heroics should have bigger rosters so numbers aren't what's stopping them. Here's the problem as someone who's in 2 guilds, one of which has successfully started Mythic and one can't seem to pull it off. The problem is the catch-22 and cross-realm system actually hurts in this respect. Let's say we have 15 raiders at the start of an expansion and we start in normal and progress to the point of doing heroic. I would say, first of all, if you're in that situation, it might be a bit different in Antorus because Antorus is going to last such a long time. Generally speaking, I don't think you've got time to progress normal, then heroic, then Mythic. I'm not saying no guilds do, but they're only going to kill like a boss or 2 in Mythic. What you need to do, if you're going to get into Mythic at any point during a tier, then you need to be clearing normal in the first week. Really. If you can't clear normal in the first week, I would worry for Mythic a lot. Normal really is pug fodder. That's for pugs. But anyway, that's a different subject. It says, heroic content is challenging enough that you can't take 30 random noobs. Well, no one's suggesting you take 30 random people you just dragged off the street. But you do want to take a lot of people. If you can take 30 people as opposed to 15, say, for heroic, there's multiple advantages this opens up. First of all, you've got more brains on a particular problem. If you're struggling with a mechanic, you've got twice as many brains on it. We'll assume everyone has a brain. Will not be mean. The second thing is, although some mechanics are made more difficult by having lots of people there, like especially if it's confined area and it's stuff where there's splash damage, those sort of fights, absolute nightmare for lots of people, granted. Those fights aside, there are at least as many fights, sometimes more, where there's actually soaking to be done, in which case having more people helps with that as well. And the other thing is, in terms of loot, the more people you have, the more items you will get. Yes, it's spread over more people, but here's the thing. Because you're going to distribute them not randomly, loot council you'd expect, it allows you, just the fact that you get more pieces of loot means you're more likely to get the useful pieces of loot and you can then move it around people to gear up everyone more quickly. 30 people gets twice as much loot as 15 people, for example. And so in theory, you'd gear up at the same rate, but you'll actually gear up at a slightly faster rate because the 15 people doing it are more likely to get pieces that are not useful to anyone. 30 people with the twice as much loot, that's less likely to happen, that you end up with wastage of loot. So you can actually gear those 30 people up a bit quicker than the 15 people. Plus, of course, you've got the people to go with. But no one is suggesting, far be it from me to suggest this, that you just take 30, you just cram it full of people. You do still need people who are suitable. If you have people who are suitable, it's better to take more than fewer. As I say, except on that rare fight where it's confined space with splash damage. Those are a bit of a nightmare with lots of people. In fact, sometimes you end up with a situation where a fight or a part of a fight can be easier on Mythic than Heroic because you've got fewer people in there. Because sometimes you need your space. Next one. Mythic is even worse for not being able to take noobs into it, of course. That's the whole point of it. So first you're left finding 20 plus people skilled enough to do it who are all willing to join your guild. The second part of the problem is when you are recruiting, usually attempt to recruit for your heroic runs with the idea of progressing to Mythic. Some people will see this and say, why the hell would you want to join a guild not raiding Mythic when I can do that right now? Well, this is true. I mean, this is the reason why, I mean, I am completely baffled how heroic guilds exist in the first place. I have to, they do exist. And there's quite a few that are perfectly stable. But I don't get it at all, because anyone who's good enough to do Mythic by definition would attempt to join a Mythic guild right from the start. Why wouldn't they? A guild that will clear Heroic and Normal in the first week and then be entirely focused on Mythic from the second week. And also, even if you've got some people that play classes and specs that are not as welcome, I mean, for example, I play a Rep Paladin. It's quite common to see multiple Rep Paladins in a Heroic roster. It's not unusual for me to look at Heroic log and see 3 Rep Paladins in it. You're not likely to see 3 Rep Paladins in a Mythic log. You occasionally do. You sometimes see 2. You more often see 1 or none. So, and then the other side of it, you've got the other classes and specs, the ones that are very desirable, like Rogues and Resto Shamers and Holy Paladins, things like that. And they'd have a much easier time of getting into a Mythic guild. So then you might imagine that there's a dearth of these in the Heroic guilds, you're like hardly to be seen. Or if they are to be seen, they're not very good. Or most of them. Obviously, some will play in those because of friends. You know, I mean, I've done that before when I quit WoW in Wrath, and then I came back in ICC, but not to raid properly, just purely because a friend was playing, so I played in a casual guild. So you do sometimes get good players in those sort of guilds, just because of the friend link. But if they're going to put this, or just because they want to raid one time a week. But there are even some Mythic guilds that do one a week. Obviously, they're not likely to complete it, but they still do it, and they still progress in Mythic with one night a week. So you can't even really say that with Heroic guilds there's a benefit in terms of the time. You know, oh, I can only really give one night a week to it. Well, find a Mythic guild that does one night a week. You know, there's I mean, it's probably not easy to do that one, but, you know, the sort of people who, for example, can only play at weekends, there are loads of weekend guilds that do Mythic. Loads of them. Some of them do very well. You know, and there's some that can't do weekends but can only do weekdays. There are guilds like that as well. You know, the fact that we're quite a while now since guilds habitually raid 4 or 5 nights a week. The most common now is 3 nights a week, and there's plenty that do 2. So that means, in terms of time committed, it's easier than it's ever been to commit to a Mythic raiding schedule over Heroic. I suppose the downside is with Legion is all the peripheral stuff, farming AP, legendaries, that sort of thing, which of course would not be a big requirement, if indeed it's a requirement at all in a Heroic guild. But anyway, yeah, the old Heroic to Mythic is one. I am still looking at comments that come my way and trying to piece something together. In terms of trying to come up with some practical advice, it's really difficult because I can't speak from experience on it, because it's a constant sort of wonder to me that they even exist. Last one. This is not really, this is a comment really, Azeroth review. So, in terms of this, so the Tuesday talk, which has now gone for 30 episodes, so it's been going for 30 weeks, and I was talking about very recently changing the name of it from the Tuesday Talk, because at the time I was looking for a new guild. I've now found a new guild, by the way. those who missed that out. And it doesn't raid on Tuesday, so that discussion will still take place on Tuesday. So there's no reason why I can't still keep calling it the Tuesday Talk. However, at the point at which I thought to myself that if I joined a guild that raided on Tuesdays and I'd have to do it on a different day, I was thinking to myself, well, I'd have to change the name then. And once I started to get into my head that I might have to change the name, I started to think, actually, possibly it would be a good idea to change the name, because the Tuesday Talk was a pretty bad name to begin with anyway, given that, in terms of drawing more people into it, it doesn't say anything about what it is. The Tuesday Talk could be on anything. There's not, there should be something in there, a reference to World of Warcraft, I feel. So I came up with a couple of ideas myself. Other people have been throwing ideas in. The people who throw ideas in that had my name, like this is Thete's Mailbox, for example. Because it's me talking. I'm talking about things that you have said, but it's just still me talking. Whereas the Tuesday Talk, the idea is that it is more of a discussion. It's still only me talking because other people have to type. But nonetheless, I'm just sort of like the chair of a meeting is how I like to see it. It's other people coming up with the topics to discuss. And I sort of almost remove myself from editorial control as such, other than obviously I'm not going to discuss anything that's either nothing to do with the topic or is like offensive. But so yeah, I thought I should call it something else. And this particular, a few people have sort of come in. I did say I'd do a poll and I didn't do a poll. But so many people have sort of suggested things in messages and stuff like that anyway. And I think I am going to go with the Azeroth review. So we're going to be calling it that. It'll still go on Tuesdays. It'll still be the same time. I'm going to change the name now, just for the sake of it. But the Azeroth review, I think, works. I think it works well. It's likely to be a constant of it. I cannot see the game still being the game when Azeroth wakes up and we have to go somewhere else. That, for me, would be a completely different World of Warcraft game. So I think we should be fairly steady with that. It should be relatively future-proof. And if at any time in the future I needed to move it to another day for whatever reason, it would allow me to do that as well. So from next Tuesday, yeah, it's still going to be the same time and everything, but it's going to be called the Azeroth Review. Hopefully, after a few weeks, it'll settle in and people will get what that's about. I'll have to start calling it from the Azeroth Review number 1 and 2 and stuff like that, which might be a bit confusing to begin with, but, we should get back on track then. So thanks very much for listening. If you've got any comments, put them down below, especially to anything I've been talking about here. We might be able to pick that up next week. If you've liked it, don't forget to give it a like. And if it's first time to my channel, you want to see more of this, don't forget to subscribe for further content as well. Share it with other people who might be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later.